This is week three in our sermon series on the life of King David. Last week we looked at the familiar story of David and Goliath. And one of the points I made last week was that we when looking at David and Goliath, we tend to assume the primary contrast is between David and Goliath. David, the young man, the Goliath, the giant warrior. David with no armor, Goliath with covered with all this weighty armor from head to toe with a shield bearer in front of him. David with only a sling and a few stones, and Goliath with his sword and spear and everything else. But I pointed out last week that I think one of the primary contrast that the narrator is trying to get us to see is not first and foremost David and Goliath, but David and Saul. King Saul, who is, we are told, a head taller than all the other Israelites. He's the tall, strong leader who ought to be leading his people, who ought to be modeling for them faith and godliness and strength. And when Goliath shows up, Saul only sees with the eyes of the flesh. He sees someone big and strong, and Saul, just like all the other Israelites, is quaking in his tent, afraid to man up and face the giant. And we see this contrast between the king that is and the king that one day will be. Saul, who ought to be leading, with David, who actually shows true leadership. Saul, who's afraid, while David shows courage. Saul, who sees with the eyes of the flesh, while David sees with the eyes of faith. We're going to see this trend over the next several chapters. I pointed that out last week, that much of the rest of the book of 1 Samuel is charting the decline of King Saul and the rise of the future King David. And we see these two characters in contrast again and again. Today, I've titled my sermon, Making a Murderer. Anyone here have Netflix? Anyone? Netflix? Okay, there's like 5. Okay, I think there's more than. Okay. All right, I've got Netflix. So on Netflix is a show that came out in December called Making a Murderer. It's a 10-part documentary detailing the life of Stephen Avery. He's a man who was exonerated and freed after spending 18 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, only to be arrested 2 years later for murder. And this documentary kind of chronicles all the little details of his initial release and then subsequent arrest, and there's all kinds of fan theories about whether he's really guilty or he's not guilty, and it's an intriguing series that can kind of draw you into this true life kind of mystery. And I bring that up and I borrow that title not because I'm trying to draw some particular parallel between Stephen Avery and King David or King Saul or something like that, but I think that title, Making a Murderer, captures what we're going to see in our text today as King Saul transitions from someone who we are told likes David, he's pleased with David, he admires David, into someone who wants to see David dead. And how do you go from point A to point B like that? How do you start off like a fan of someone, pleased with them, delighted in them, to hatching plan after plan after plan to try to have that person killed? We're going to see that. I'm going to cover 2 chapters. We had 1 Samuel 18, verses 5 to 9 read. But together we're going to go through all of chapter 18 and 19. Chapter 18 are all of Saul's kind of subtle, behind-the-scenes attempts to have David killed. And when that doesn't work, chapter 19 is him just being more direct and kind of widening the circle of people that he's drawing in to try to join him in his efforts to kill David. And how do you go down that path? How do you become, even though he's ultimately not successful in killing David, how do you someone get to that point where their heart is so corrupted that all they're thinking about is having someone else killed? I don't suspect, I think there's enough, societal and cultural pressures and threats in terms of prison and other consequences that I don't suspect that too many in here will be threatened to go that far in their anger of someone or in their desire for revenge or punishment or something like that. And yet, even if we don't get all the, as far as Saul does in his murderous intent, there's a continuum. There's kind of a spectrum here, and how far are we going to let our hearts get soured towards someone? How much bitterness are we going to let build up? How much anger and jealousy and whatever else are we going to let build up? Even if we don't get to that point that Saul does, I hope that we're the kind of people that go to war with sin, that go to war with anger as it rises in the heart, rather than letting it fester and begin to multiply and become a cancer that eats away at us from the inside out. So we're going to look through these texts and I think draw some important lessons for us to keep us from going down that path. I'm going to skip over chapter 18, verses 1 to 4. Not because it's not important, but because next week it kind of introduces this friendship between David and Jonathan. And next week, the whole sermon is going to be focused on that friendship. So we'll kind of, for now, skip over that. We'll come back to it next week. But I want to pick up the narrative in 1 Samuel 18, starting in verse 5. And verse 5 does a little bit of foreshadowing. It says, "Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well." This is inserted just to kind of give a summary statement over the next probably number of months and years in their dynamic. That David is so successful that there's this, all the Israelites, all the people want to see him rise, and it's kind of stupid not to, as he's winning victories for the Israelites, and so he's continuing to rise in prominence. But then verse 6 kind of brings it back to the timeline of where we're at in this story, because this is piggybacking right off of last week where we looked at David and Goliath, and verse 6 brings us kind of back into the story and focuses in there. So we read in verse 6 that when the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with tambourines and lutes. As they danced, they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands." Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They've credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. You might remember back a couple weeks ago as we kind of jumped into the life of David, I referred to an event that took place in chapter 13. In 1 Samuel 13, there's this incident where the Israelites are going to go to battle against the Philistines. There's skirmishes happening on a regular basis. The Philistines are one of their main kind of enemies at this point. And there's a section of land that they keep competing for. And so the Israelites are going to go to war. Saul is their king, and he's going to lead them. But they're waiting for Samuel, the prophet, to come give this sacrifice on behalf of the army before they go into battle. And Samuel says, "I'm going to be there in 7 days. We'll do the sacrifice. Then you can fight." The seventh day comes, and Saul's just getting antsy. He's like, I don't want to wait any longer. And so he goes ahead and he does the sacrifice himself, rather than waiting. And sure enough, as soon as, maybe we've had moments like this where you're waiting, you finally do it, and as soon as you do it, the thing you were waiting for finally arrives. And you're like, duh! That's just, Murphy's Law kind of thing. It always seems to work out that way. But Samuel shows up just after Saul kind of gives this sacrifice. And we read in 1 Samuel 13, verse 13, It says, "You acted foolishly," Samuel said. "You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." I can imagine for Saul, those words echoed in his mind for a long time. Whether it was godly, repentance, or probably more likely just regret, frustration that I got caught and it backfired. This didn't go the way that I wanted. But God takes obedience seriously, particularly in his leaders, and he sees in Saul someone who is just, again, looking with the eyes of the flesh. He's afraid his army is going to get impatient, and he's kind of gauging everything by these worldly standards. And Samuel says, that the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people. Saul was still king, and he was going to still be king for quite a while after that. But Saul knows from that point on that God has someone else in mind. That God has begun to fill his position even while he's in place. Maybe you've been an employer or been an employee and been in a situation where it's not working out, and before the person's fired, the boss is already kind of planning who's going to be the replacement, kind of training up the person so that they're ready to go to push out the next. And Saul knows at this point that God has someone else in mind. And that continues, I think, to play in Saul's mind again and again. And rather than humbly accepting the consequences that he knows he deserves for his disobedience, there's a sense in which he sets himself up against God, trying to fight against this decision that God has made, trying to say, no, I'm keeping this job. I'm not, I'm here and I don't want to lose power. There's a sense in which he sets his mindset against God and trying to preserve this power and position that he has. And that's Saul's kind of default mode of operation. Rather than humbling himself and seeking the Lord and repenting when he needs to and praying that God would show mercy and grace, which is exactly what David will do when he sins because he's not flawless. But Saul, rather than repenting, rather than confessing, rather than humbling and pleading to God for mercy and grace, he becomes more defiant. And he uses the tools of the flesh to try to stop the plans of God. And chapters 18 and 19 are essentially Saul's efforts to use the tools of the flesh to stop God's purposes. He begins to sense that maybe David is the guy that God is grooming to be king. And he sets himself up in opposition to God, trying to squash that, trying to stop this in its tracks. And so we see at least 3 attempts in chapter 18 for Saul to try to kill David. First by spear in verses 10 and 11. It says, "The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand and he hurled it, saying to himself, 'I'll pin David to the wall.' But David eluded him twice." There's an interesting, that right at the end there, David eluded him twice, raises 2 possibilities. One is that after having the spear hurled at him once, he's like, okay, I'll let that one go, I'll sit back down, and then Saul takes another attempt at it. What I think is probably intended here when it says that David eluded him twice, I think that's foreshadowing, because we're going to see this in the next chapter. In chapter 19, this happens again where Saul hurls a spear at David once more. And so I think this is saying David eluded him twice, is probably referring to this and that subsequent event. But Saul is being afflicted by this evil spirit. A passage that we didn't dwell on, I kind of skipped over the second half of chapter 16. This is before David and Goliath. there's this account of how this was a regular occurrence for Saul. He'd be afflicted from time to time and would just struggle. There's a sense in which there's, we're going to see this on and on. It's almost like he gets these, bouts of madness, or, I don't know if there's schizophrenia or some kind of other thing kind of at play, some demonically influenced kind of mindset, but he has these times where he's just afflicted and he can't think straight, and he's kind of, being troubled, and his attendants, his servants there say, well, we should do something about this. Maybe find someone who can play the harp, someone who can maybe try to calm you down and kind of get you out of this mindset. And they discovered that David was a skilled musician, and he plays for the king and kind of brought relief to Saul. So this is an ongoing thing, and we're told that David was playing, trying to bring relief to Saul. And in this kind of moment, Saul just can't contain it. He kind of snaps, grabs a spear, hurls it at David. David dodges and is kind of spared for a moment. And presumably this kind of mental state passes, and kind of Saul has these moments where he's kind of crazy and then he kind of relents. We'll see this in chapter 19 where Jonathan kind of persuades him to kind of back off. He's like, okay, I won't kill David. But then it lasts all of like a week or something. Like he's not a very predictable guy. He's kind of up and down. His mental state, his emotional state is a bit of a roller coaster. But his first attempt is with the spear, but it's behind closed doors. It's not this public, visible thing. But as we continue in the story, his attempts get more and more direct until finally they're kind of overt and public. The second attempt to kill David is by Philistines, using and hoping that the Philistines will do the deed, that they will take care of David. We see that in verses 12 to 17. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had left Saul. So he sent David away from him and gave him command over 1,000 men, and David led the troops in their campaigns. In everything he did, he had great success because the Lord was with him. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. So we're not quite told that this promotion of David, being, put in command over 1,000 men, we're not explicitly told then that that's with the hopes that David would be killed in battle. But as we continue, you can see that this is behind Saul's mindset in wanting David to keep on fighting. Look at verses 17 and 18. Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. Only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord." For Saul said to himself, "I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that." So Saul has this plan. If you remember from the David and Goliath story, one of the things that was promised for the man that kills Goliath is one of the king's daughters in marriage. And yet notice how Saul presents this. This is not a prize for past accomplishments. This is a promise for future work. He's not saying, you've earned the marriage of one of my daughters, here she is. This is, here's one of my daughters, only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. You can marry my daughter so long as you keep doing this thing, because in the back of his mind, he's hoping that the Philistines are going to eventually kill him. How does David respond? Look at verse 18. But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my family or my father's clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So when the time came for Merab, Saul's daughter, to be given to David, she was given in marriage to Adriel of Meholah. David is so kind of overcome with this humility, this unworthiness, this feeling undeserving of being a son-in-law to the king, that he passes. He didn't feel qualified. He didn't come from a wealthy family. He didn't come, with some great pedigree or genealogy. If you know the end of the story of Ruth, that Ruth was David's great-grandmother. She was a Moabite. David doesn't have this, perfect Hebrew pedigree. He felt unworthy. And it wasn't because he was unwilling to keep fighting. We'll see David has this heart. He's serving the king, whether he marries a daughter or not. He's going to keep fighting the Lord's battles. He's going to keep kind of risking his life. But he just feels unworthy here, and so Merab is given to someone else in marriage. But we see so that kind of backfires. David is continually victorious against the Philistines. He doesn't marry Merab, but then Saul hatches another plan. We see in verse 20 and 21 that another daughter of his is in love with David, and Saul tries to capitalize on that. We read in verse 20, Saul's daughter Michal was in love with David, and when they told Saul about it, he was pleased. I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So Saul said to David, now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law. This is interesting here because, David had eluded the king's spear and the Philistines' weapons, but Saul thinks perhaps he can be ensnared by a woman. Maybe she can be his downfall. And he imagines that she could be a snare in two ways. First, she could motivate David to put his life more and more at risk against the Philistines, whether that's through Saul kind of trying to speak through his daughter. Encourage him to do this. Tell him if he was really brave, he'd do that. Maybe Saul hopes to have an influence, an ongoing influence through his daughter to keep having David get riskier and riskier in his battles. But more than that, I think she could be a snare in corrupting David spiritually. We'll see in chapter 19, verse 13, that she had idols that she possessed, and you wouldn't keep idols if you didn't have them as some part of your spiritual life. So we can imagine that she's in some regular way worshiping idols, and perhaps Saul sees that maybe he knows his daughter and knows that she could be part of David's spiritual downfall, introducing him to temptation, taking him away, and if the blessing of God on David could be removed, then perhaps that would be a way of preserving the kingship, preserving his role as king and disposing of David. It's hard to know for sure if all of that is in Saul's minds. It does seem that he wants her to be a snare, and I would imagine there's an awareness of her idolatry. But whether or not he fully understood the potential ways in which she could pull David away from the Lord, without a doubt, Satan gets that. And I wonder for how many people today he uses the snare of a boyfriend or girlfriend, or a marriage, husband or wife, or even just a good friend or a co-worker to sow seeds of doubt, worldliness, idolatry in our lives. The Apostle Paul was aware of this temptation. He strongly warned the Corinthians. He said that bad company corrupts good character. My mom used to say that when I was a kid. Bad company corrupts good character. Maybe you heard that growing up. But there's a truth to that. Who you hang around is more often than not who you become. The people you surround yourself with end up shaping and forming you. That's one of the scary things as a parent is, when you get to the point where you realize my kids are going to spend far more time with their friends and kind of those influences out there than me, and it's a scary thing to know, I'm limited in what I can do, and the world is increasingly going to influence. And I wonder, who are the influences in your life? Who are the people you're surrounding yourself with? And perhaps is Satan, ultimately behind some situation or some relationship? Because so often people, and especially a boyfriend, a girlfriend, that kind of dynamic can so easily detract, pull us away from our focus on the Lord. Maybe it's not overt with oh, here's my idol, come bow down to this statue with me. I doubt that there's a whole lot of that kind of temptation going on today, but it might be, why do you spend so much time going to church, hanging out with your church friends? I mean, why can't we do this? You don't need to be in a small group. We could do this thing every Wednesday night, or we could do that. Or it's often this subtle pressure to kind of pull you away from the things of God, or it might not even be that as much as you just know that if you're around someone whose heart is on their appearance and how they look, it's easy to get sucked into this kind of worldly mindset with my own appearance. Well, how do I look? Am I fit enough? Am I thin enough? Am I pretty enough or handsome enough or whatever? Or maybe they're into the newest technology and you're sitting here with your 8-year-old, Windows 2000, computer, 8 years, probably 10, 15, whatever, and you're like, you've got your little flip phone here and you're kind of looking around like, I'm kind of being left out of this thing. I'm not that cool. I'm not that hip. I'm not whatever. And you can kind of get sucked into just wanting to fit in and wanting to kind of take on the priorities of the people around you. And whether that's materialism, whether that's whatever that is, there can be so many different things, and your heart begins to be corrupted. And it doesn't happen overnight. Usually it's subtle. You just kind of slowly get acclimated to this new environment, this new mindset, this new set of priorities. It may not be that you've ever formally rejected God, but you can easily get to the point where God is no longer the focus of your life, where God is no longer what you're pursuing. He's kind of in the passenger seat. He's no longer driving. He's kind of there, and you're kind of glad that he's still around because I'm still a Christian. It's often that kind of identity. I'm still a Christian, but where is Christ in your life? Christian means Christ follower. Are you still following? Or are you following the ways of the world? And I think it's so important that we keep a pulse on our relationships. Paul in 2 Corinthians 6 tells us not to be yoked together with unbelievers. And if you hear yoke and you think egg, then you don't understand that passage. Don't be scrambled together in a pan with other believers. A yoke is a harness. It was something that would go over farm animals as they plowed the fields. It would pull the plow, and a yoke, there would be a double yoke that would have two arches that would go for two animals to pull together. And so it's this image of don't hitch up to someone who's not pulling the same direction with the same pace. Make sure that you're aligned with people that you're spending a lot of your time with. That passage surely applies to marriage, but it doesn't exclusively apply to marriage. It's not just about, well, you got to marry a believer, but it's what, the major chunks, the major relationships in your life. Might be a friend, might be a coworker, something like that. But oftentimes we allow these major relationships to form where we're spending lots and lots and lots of time with someone beyond simply a work capacity or whatever, where you're increasingly being influenced by them because you're not moving the same direction. You're maybe going opposite directions, or maybe you're even going in the same direction at different paces. I don't think this passage, do not be, yoked, unequally yoked. It doesn't mean that as long as you marry a Christian, you're all set, because we know someone they may legitimately be saved, or they might just call themselves a Christian, but it doesn't mean that you're at the same pace, at the same intensity. It doesn't mean you're actually really moving the same direction. Find people in your life that stir you, that align with you, that help you to plow forward in the work that God has called you to do. Be careful. Bad company corrupts good character, and watch out for the people that might get brought into your life that might be a snare to you, that might lure you away. That's exactly what Saul hopes his daughter will be for David. And as we continue reading, we'll see in verses 22 and 23, Saul ordered his attendants, speak to David privately and say, look, the king is pleased with you. His attendants all like you. Now become his son-in-law. Saul wants peer pressure. He wants get a bunch of people around David all pushing him in this direction. Verse 23, they repeated these words to David, but David said, do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. So the little known, feeling unworthy because of his pedigree and connections and things like that was already brought up earlier with Saul's other daughter. But here David specifically mentions, I'm a poor man. And I think one of the things in his mind is a cultural practice of the time would be for a dowry or a bride price. Not that you buy the daughter, but it would traditionally be a gift that the groom would give to the father-in-law for some measure of compensation for the loss of his daughter. Nowadays, we expect the father-in-law to pay for the wedding, but then as a groom, you're expected to honor the father-in-law by giving him something significant because he's losing a daughter. That's a big deal, and so there was this expectation of some kind. Typically, it was monetary, or here's 5 cattle, or here's a sheep or something. But this is something of value. But Saul recognizes that David might have this thought or this hesitation, and again he tries to use this against David. Verse 24, when Saul's servants told him what David had said, Saul replied, say to David, the king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. So Saul again uses this leverage. How can I use this against David? Okay, I'm going to set the bride price as 100 Philistine foreskins, which I'm pretty confident they're not just going to hand over. This is something you've got to fight to get. They don't give those away easily. I don't particularly recommend, for any prospective grooms in the house. Vadim, I know you're engaged. I don't recommend 100 foreskins for the father-in-law. Not a gift we would relish today, but obviously this is about Saul. How can I undermine David? Can I corrupt him? Can I distract him? Can I outright kill him? What can I do to get David away? He's a threat to Saul. And so he sets this requirement, which would be, at least in his mind, this is kind of an insurmountable thing. And yet look at what David does. Verse 26, when the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. Let's just double it just because I can. Take that. Killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented the full number to the king so that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him his daughter Michal in marriage. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. The Philistine commanders continued to go out to battle, and as often as they did, David met with more success than the rest of Saul's officers, and his name became well known. One of the things that we see in this, when your heart is on God, when you're focused on Him, when God's Spirit is with you, nothing can happen outside of His sovereign care. You are invincible under God's sovereign protection. That doesn't mean that no harm may come you, but it means that God is in charge and nothing is going to thwart or get in the way of His purposes for you. And no matter how hard Saul tries to undermine David and attack David and have things go against David, it's interesting how every one of these things ends up furthering David's rise, right? Go get 100 Philistines. He's going to get killed. And then here comes 200, and everyone's like, wow, let's follow David. He's great, the more that Saul tries to do to undercut him, the more David in his faithfulness, his responsibility, his obedience to God, the more that God blesses him. And all of these arrows coming at him are deflected, and David continues to be blessed. And Saul sees that, and his fear of David grows. In chapter 19, his efforts become even more overt. Chapter 18, they're like, I'm hoping the Philistines are going to do it. Maybe my daughter will lead him astray. In chapter 19, he gets a bit more direct. Look at verse 1. It says, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what has he done, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. So Saul's like, all right, he's getting more overt. He tells Jonathan and all his attendants to kill David. Jonathan appeals and ultimately is successful. And Saul relents. Things kind of die down for a bit, but it doesn't last long. Verse 8, once more, war broke out. And David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the harp, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. And so here we get this again. This time David's like, I'm out of here. I'm not hanging around to see what happens next. I'm gone. And we continue reading in verse 11. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol, laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent his men to capture David, Michal said, he's ill. Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him. But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? Michal told him, he said to me, let me get away. Why should I kill you? Let me just kind of summarize a little bit here. So Saul has another kind of fit. He's being afflicted, hurls a spear. David gets away. Saul says, all right, send some men to wait for him and kill him. His daughter Michal realizes this, tells David to escape. She kind of takes this idol, which would have been of somewhat substantial size if it can, double for a body hidden in a bed. So he puts this idol in the bed, puts some goat hair at the top, tries to, pass it off as David being sick in bed. And so Saul's men get there, and say, Saul wants to see, or I know that they come there to kill him, and then his daughter Michal says, sorry, he's in bed, he's sick, don't bother him. And because it's the king's daughter, they kind of feel timid, like should they just kind of press through? What should they do? They go back to King Saul. He says, if he can't get out of bed, bring his bed to me. I want to end this thing. I'm sick of playing around. If he's ill in bed, bring the whole bed here. And of course they go in. He's not actually ill. He's not actually in bed. He's already left. And Michal, when she's confronted by her father, comes up with a convenient lie. It's not that David actually threatened her, but it's a pretty convenient lie because they can't really argue with that. If she's complicit, she might be killed. And so she says, well, he threatened to kill me. Oh, okay, you can't argue with that. I wasn't there. Okay, you're off the hook. So she comes up with this lie to kind of get out of it. But then look at how the story unfolds from there. Verse 18, when David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. word came to Saul, "David is in Naioth at Ramah." So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time, and they also prophesied. It's like, what's going on here? Finally, he himself left for Ramah, went to the great cistern at Secu, and he asked, "Where are Samuel and David?" "Over in Naioth at Ramah," they said. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even upon him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his robes and also prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay that way all that day and night. This is why people say, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" This is one of those stories that when you read this, life of David. Oh, this is cool. We're going to learn about David and Goliath, and there's some familiar stories. I would imagine this is kind of one of those stories that flies under the radar that we kind of forget about. But this is an incredible thing. Saul wants to kill David, and he sends his men to kill him. And it shows the power of God to intervene any way he wants. Like, if God wanted, okay, asteroid, boom, you're gone, He could do whatever he wants. This time, God intervenes and stops the death of David by bringing such a spiritual presence on the men assigned to kill David that they can't even follow through on their mission. And they're just kind of like wrapped up into this ecstatic, prophetic experience. So one group of soldiers come, and they get drawn into this little prayer meeting thing going on, and all of a sudden they start prophesying and going along with it. Next batch, same thing. Next batch, same thing. Saul's like, "Good grief, what's going on? Can't anyone finish the job?" Fine, you got to do it right. Do it yourself. He shows up, and he doesn't even. I love this because all the others, it's when they get there that this happens. And for Saul, notice it's while he's on the way. He starts prophesying on the way to Naioth, and when he gets there, he's so kind of wrapped into this experience, he strips down naked, and it's almost like God humiliates him and incapacitates him for a whole day and a night. Like, you come to kill David, okay, boom, and he's in this crazy experience, and he doesn't know what's going on. He strips down naked, and it's like, you want to kill my guy? Watch out, It's like, and it's not like God doesn't strike him dead. He's still the king, but it's like he humbles him. When you try to fight against God, you're going to lose every time. And God can do whatever he wants to intervene. And here it's just this picture of the power of God's Spirit and God's willingness to protect those who are his. It's just, I don't know, it's a reminder, one, that, not every, that we need to be discerning with these kinds of ecstatic experiences. Not all of them are God honoring. At least the nakedness and the kind of the it seems like he's kind of in some sense immersed in this experience in some kind of a crazy way. Maybe what's being prophesied is good. We know that earlier in chapter 18, where he was prophesying that the evil spirit came on him and he was prophesying in his house, and I'd imagine that's not truthful, God-honoring prophecy if it's inspired by an evil spirit. So we need to be discerning about the kinds of things that we, what others claim to say they've done or heard or seen or experienced. We need to be discerning of that. But I think this bigger picture of God's protection, his intervention on behalf of his own, no matter what people do to try to stop God's plans, it's just an incredible picture of God's love, his sovereign protection. But as we kind of back up, let's bring it back and kind of begin to wrap up by looking at Saul. How does he get from admiring David, respecting David, being pleased with David, to doing one thing after another to try to kill David? How do you get there? As we make a diagnosis, what we see is in chapter 18, as was read earlier. Chapter 18, verse 8, Saul was angry as they were singing this refrain, Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. This refrain galled him. It says from verse 9, from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. There's anger, there's jealousy. The Bible again and again points to the dangers of envy and jealousy. Oftentimes in Scripture, envy and jealousy go hand in hand. In English, I don't know if you know the distinction between them. Jealousy is the fear of someone taking away something from you. So if some guy, is hanging out with your wife, it's a fear of something being taken away from me. You become jealous of that person who threatens to take something away. Envy is when you are angry that someone has something that you don't have and you want. At least in English, that's the distinction. Biblically, the Hebrew words and Greek words for envy and jealousy aren't quite as distinct. They kind of overlap a bit. But the heart of that is this competition, this feeling threatened by someone else, wanting what they have and not wanting them to take what you have. The Bible addresses this all over the place. I would imagine that most people don't think they have a big issue with this, and I think we're often blind to the degree to which envy and jealousy have crept into our own hearts. In Mark 7:22, Jesus includes envy in a list of sins which come from the heart and make a man unclean. In Galatians 5, Paul includes it in a list of prominent sins produced by the sinful nature. Paul includes it in 1 Timothy 6 and in Titus 3. Peter includes it in a list of sins in 1 Peter 2. Like almost every time there's a list of sins that are a big deal, we get jealousy or envy somewhere in that list. Henry Fairley, in his book on the 7 deadly sins, commented that if we confessed each day how often we had been envious during it, he says that we would be on our knees longer than for any other sin. Proverbs 14:30 says that envy rots the bones. And an ancient Greek proverb says that as rust corrupts iron, so envy corrupts man. Jealousy, envy are like rot to wood and rust to metal. They have a way of starting small and festering and corrupting and corroding from the inside out. Have you ever had someone not like you for no apparent reason? You didn't feel like you ever did anything against them. You never really hurt them in any particular way, but for some reason it just seems like they don't like you very much. They seem out to get you in some way. There's a good chance that envy or jealousy is at the root of the issue there. There's something that you have that the other person wants, or something that they have that they're afraid you might take away or undermine. You may not have a clue to what it is, and they may not even realize it, but it's easy to resent people who have what we think we're more deserving of. I think envy is jealousy. There's sins of proximity. We tend to be envious not of people out there somewhere, but it's the people that we rub shoulders with. Soren Kierkegaard once said that envy is a small-town sin, a byproduct of living so close to a set of other people that one is constantly tempted to make comparisons. I would imagine that too many people aren't actively jealous of Warren Buffett or Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or someone who's just filthy, stinking rich and everything, having the great life as we might imagine or something in terms of the American dream. We might admire that, or we might say, oh, isn't that interesting? But we typically don't get jealous of them. It doesn't bother us to our core. It's when people close to us that we think we're more deserving of. It's the coworker who gets bumped up, who gets a promotion when we think that we are more deserving. It's the friend who, can't seem to do anything right, and yet everything seems to go his way, and it begins to sour that friendship. It's the neighbor who's always away on work trips, but yet still seems to have a healthier marriage than you. Or the relative that is a jerk, and yet they get more of the inheritance than you. We tend to envy and be jealous of those who are close to us, those who we feel are less deserving than us to have what they have. And because of this, because of the proximity and just the nature of envy and jealousy, it tends to be a same-sex sin. Men tend to envy other men. Women tend to envy other women. Whether it's looks, whether it's strength, whether it's following or influence, we're most likely to envy the people that we feel most similar to in some ways, whether it's income, recognition, appearance, possessions. We envy the people that we compare ourselves with the most. We resent their success because we measure our worth, our value based on what others think of us. We feel good about ourselves if we are better or worse than those around us. I'm not saying that's how it should be. I'm saying that's the ground from which envy and jealousy grows. And when we recognize that, when we recognize the root of envy and jealousy is about comparison, and more than that, it's about identity, self-worth. Where do you find your worth? Where do you find your value? Where do you find your importance and your significance? Is it in what people think of you? Is it in what you have? Is it in how you look? If it's in any of those things, then envy and jealousy are always a step away. If you find your worth in how you look, then you'll easily become envious or jealous of someone who, doesn't even have to diet and somehow they stay fit and trim and healthy. That doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem, God, what's going on here? If you find your worth in your grades, and then you begin to resent the person who doesn't seem to study very hard and yet always seems to do better than you on tests. If you find your worth in, your influence, then you get frustrated when, someone seems to get more power. This is something that can easily happen among pastors. That other church in town seems to be growing, but I'm better than that guy. I'm a better preacher than him. What's going on here? God, this is unjust. When you find envy stirring up in your heart, what you need to ask yourself is, where are you finding your worth? Where are you finding your true joy and satisfaction? Because I think the root issue, which this is the issue for Saul, Saul's finding his worth in his position as king, in the respect he gets from the people. So when David is getting more respect, he's slain his 10,000s, but I'm only credited with 1,000. This isn't right. He's got his worth, his identity all wrapped up in what other people think of him. And because of that, we read more than once that he was afraid of David. Chapter 18, verse 12, Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had left Saul. This fear grows. We see that at the end of chapter 18, verses 28 and 29. When Saul realized the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy. It's this fear because it's a fear of, you can take away my worth. You can take away my value. You can empty the things that I'm finding all of my satisfaction and life in. But if you find your joy and satisfaction and your worth in what God thinks of you and who you are to Him, that can't be taken away. And I think if you want to go to war, this slide that we can slip on from envy and jealousy to fear and anger that ultimately leads to murder, if you want to nip that in the bud, the way you do it is start at the beginning when that envy, that competition, that comparison with others begins to emerge, and to check your priorities and say, where's my worth really? Is it in what other people think of me? Is it in how I look? Is it how strong I am? Is it how big my church is, or how great my reputation is? Or where ultimately am I finding my worth? Because when you find your worth in what God thinks of you, it changes everything. It frees you from this competition, this envy and jealousy. I want to wrap up with one glimpse as we contrast Saul and David. So Saul is afraid, he's angry, he's jealous because his whole worth can be taken away by David becoming king. He's wrapped up his whole worth in this fragile thing that can be stripped away. But look at David, and we get a glimpse into David's heart in Psalm 59. I want you to skip over if you can. We're going to wrap up with Psalm 59 here. As we go through this series, one of the things I love about this series on David is again and again we're going to get these glimpses where a certain psalm was written in relation to a particular event. And so we get to anchor that psalm into some part of the timeline of David's life. And in Psalm 59, if you see the little kind of intro to that, it says, "For the director of music, to the tune of Do Not Destroy, of David," it's the Psalm of David, a miktam, when Saul had sent men to watch David's house in order to kill him, which we just read about in 1 Samuel 19. And so David's escaping, he's running away because of Michal's warning to him. And this is what David records of his attitude during this time when he's on the run, having to flee. "Deliver me from my enemies, O God. Protect me from those who rise up against me." Where's his focus? It's on the Lord. "Deliver me from evildoers. Save me from bloodthirsty men. See how they lie in wait for me. Fierce men conspire against me for no offense of sin or sin of mine, O Lord. I have done no wrong, yet they are ready to attack me. Arise to help me. Look on my plight. O Lord God Almighty, the God of Israel, rouse yourself to punish all the nations. Show no mercy to wicked traitors." He goes on to describe them, building up to verse 9. "O my strength, I watch for you. You, O God, are my fortress, my loving God." I love how David, at times in the Psalms, kind of creates pet names for God, if you will. It's maybe a bad way of describing it, but it's like he creates names for God. "O my strength, I watch for you. You, O God, are my fortress, my loving God." And he continues, but we'll focus just at the end, the last couple verses 16 and 17. "But I will sing of your strength. In the morning I will sing of your love, for you are my fortress, my refuge in times of trouble. O my strength, I sing praise to you. You, O God, are my fortress, my loving God." He's on the run with men trying to kill him, and compare his attitude to that of Saul, who's king, has all the power that he might want. Saul is afraid, he's panicking, and David is at peace. Why? Because he knows whom he's trusting in. He finds his strength in God, his fortress, and that can't be taken away. And us too, when we find our joy, our strength, our identity, our worth in God, it can't be taken away, and we won't get sucked into that kind of envy and anger and bitterness. Now let's pray together. Father God, I know how much easier said than done this is. For those in this room who find themselves susceptible to envy and anger, bitterness and jealousy, whether it's a relative or a friend, a coworker, God, I pray that you would draw our hearts back to you. God, that we would find our worth in what you think of us, not in the approval of man, not in trying to impress those around us. God, I pray that you would so anchor our love, our priorities in you, that we have a peace that can't be taken away, that's not like a roller coaster depending on our circumstances, but something that is stable and steadfast no matter what challenges or obstacles come our way. God, help us to come to you as our fortress, our stronghold, our strength, trusting in your sovereign protection, knowing that as we follow you, nothing can harm us without getting and going through you first. So God, give us right hearts to love you most. Free us from the approval of man. We pray this in your name. Amen.